The beginning of the 20th century transformed the Baltic Sea into an arena for clashing imperial ambitions. The Gulf of Riga, a natural harbor protected by the islands of the Moonsund archipelago, acquired a strategic importance that is difficult to overestimate. Control over these waters meant dominance over maritime trade routes and the ability to project military power deep into enemy territories. For the Russian Empire, the Gulf served as a natural shield, covering the approaches to Petrograd, the nervous center of the state. Germany, in turn, saw it as the key to dominating the entire Baltic. Economic interests intertwined with military ones. Up to 70% of Russian exports passed through the ports of the Baltic region. And for Germany, these waters were a vital space for fleet maneuvering. The geopolitical puzzle was complicated by the presence of other powers' interests. Britain, striving to maintain the balance of power, and France, supporting its Russian ally. When the Great War broke out, sea communications acquired critical importance. Whoever controls the sea dictates conditions on land. The Gulf of Riga became a focal point for naval forces, where the fate of not only the region, but also the entire Eastern Front was to be decided. By the summer of 1915, the confrontation between the naval giants reached its peak. The German Imperial Fleet, the brainchild of Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, represented a formidable force, consisting of the newest dreadnoughts of the König and Kaiser classes. These steel leviathans, each armed with 10 350mm guns, could unleash salvos weighing over 5 tons at a range of up to 20 kilometers. The flagship of the German squadron, the battleship Nassau, with a displacement of 20,000 tons, was a true floating fortress, capable of withstanding hits from large caliber shells, thanks to its armor belt 300 millimeters thick. A particular threat was posed by the light cruisers of the Magdeburg and Augsburg classes, which developed speeds of up to 27 knots. Their maneuverability, combined with 10 105mm guns, made them ideal for raids and reconnaissance operations in the shallow waters of the Gulf of Riga. The Kaiser's submarine fleet numbered 22 submarines, capable of stealthily penetrating minefields and delivering sudden torpedo strikes. The Russian Baltic fleet countered the Germans with 4 5-class battleships, including the 6 and 7, the first domestic dreadnoughts, launched only 2 years before the war. Each was armed with 12 305mm guns, capable of penetrating 300mm armor from a distance of 15 kilometers. The cruiser brigade squadron, under the command of Rear Admiral Bakirev, included the legendary .8 and .9, ships that were inferior to the Germans in speed but surpassed them in firepower. The true 10 of the Russian fleet were the 11-class destroyers, which developed an incredible speed for those times, 37 knots. These swift ships, armed with mines and torpedoes, became a nightmare for German captains. Russia's submarine fleet was small, only 7 boats, but their crews compensated for this with desperate bravery and tactical ingenuity. A key advantage for the Russians was the minefields, which turned the approaches to the bay into a deadly labyrinth. More than 2,000 mines of various types were laid with mathematical precision, creating an insurmountable barrier for large enemy ships. Maps of these minefields were kept in strict secrecy and were known only to a few senior officers. The Germans relied on technological superiority and artillery precision, while the Russians relied on knowledge of local conditions and defensive tactics. The Baltic confrontation resembled a chess game, where each move could cost hundreds of lives and millions of rubles in sunken ships. The battle for the Gulf of Riga was to determine whose strategy would prove more effective in real combat conditions. For months before the operation in the Gulf of Riga began, the headquarters of both empires transformed into veritable analytical centers. Maps, diagrams, intelligence reports, all of this coalesced into a complex mosaic of the future battle. The German command, led by Vice Admiral Erhard Schmidt, developed a plan codenamed Albion, a bold attempt to break into the Gulf, followed by the destruction of Russian naval forces and the capture of control over the strategically important islands of the Moonsund archipelago. The German strategy was built on three pillars: speed, power, and surprise. The first phase involved large-scale minesweeping using specialized Fuchs-class minesweepers, equipped with the latest sonar devices. Then, a swift breakthrough of the main forces under the cover of a smokescreen and overwhelming artillery fire on coastal batteries. The final blow was to be delivered by submarines, cutting off the Russian fleet's retreat routes. The Russian command, headed by Vice Admiral Nikolai Ottovich von Essen, countered this with the quote, 2 plan, an echeloned defense based on the principle of quote, 3. The first line consisted of minefields, arranged according to a special scheme known only to Russian pilots. The second echelon comprised mobile groups of destroyers and submarines ready to attack enemy ships that broke through. The third line was formed by heavy ships and coastal artillery. Naval intelligence played a special role in the planning. The Russian agent network in Germany, established even before the war, regularly supplied information about the movements of German ships. Radio interception, carried out by special stations on the coast, allowed for tracking German captains' communications. Aerial reconnaissance using M9 seaplanes provided real-time observation of the water area. The Germans also did not sit idly by. Their agents in the Baltic states collected data on Russian fortifications and the location of coastal batteries. Submarines, risking detection, conducted covert photography of the coast. Particularly valuable was information about depths and currents in the Gulf, which could affect the effectiveness of minefields. Preparation for the operation also included psychological conditioning of the crews. German sailors were instilled with the idea of the technical superiority of their ships and the inevitability of victory. Russian officers emphasized combat traditions and the defense of their native shores. Both sides understood the upcoming battle would be not just a clash of steel and gunpowder, but also a test of morale. The invisible war beneath the waves of the Gulf of Riga began long before the first artillery salvos. Mine barrages became the secret weapon that changed the very nature of naval combat. The Russian fleet deployed a true underwater web, over 2,000 mines of various types. Anchor mines from 1908, equipped with sensitive Hertz detonators, could be triggered even by a light touch to a ship's hull. Deep-sea mines, placed at various depths, from 3 to 15 meters, posed a particular danger, making passage for German ships virtually impossible without prior sweeping. Russian mine layers displayed incredible ingenuity. They created so-called mine banks, special clusters of mines arranged in a staggered pattern. This configuration prevented enemy minesweepers from clearing a safe passage in a single sweep. Moreover, Russian engineers developed a system of mine traps, where the first line of mines was relatively easy to detect, followed by a second, camouflaged and much denser line. The German command, aware of the mine threat, sent a special flotilla of Fuchs-type minesweepers at the vanguard of its forces. These small vessels, equipped with Schultz steel sweeps, moved in pairs, stretching a steel cable between them, which was supposed to cut the mine ropes. the cables holding the mines in place. However, the Russians had foreseen this too. Some mines were equipped with anti-sweeping devices that would snag the sweep and explode, destroying it along with the minesweeper. The sweeping process turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. German sailors, risking their lives, slowly advanced, literally feeling out every meter of the seabed. Work continued around the clock, by day under the cover of smoke screens, by night in absolute darkness, navigating only by compass and stars. Every wrong move could cost the entire crew their lives. Russian observers from coastal posts and seaplanes carefully monitored enemy actions. As soon as a swept passage was detected, high-speed mine layers of the Immerse type were immediately dispatched to it, restoring the minefield in the shortest possible time. This tactic of mine regeneration drove German commanders to despair. They had to sweep the same areas multiple times. Submarines played a special role in the mine war. The Russian submarine Akula, under the command of Captain Second-Rank Budakov, carried out daring raids to German bases, laying mines directly on the paths of enemy ships. German submariners retaliated in kind, attempting to mine the channels of Russian ships at the entrance to the Moonsund archipelago. In early 20th century naval strategy, small ships often proved to be the decisive factor in confrontations between steel giants. The Riga operation became a true triumph for these sea mosquitoes, destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines, which transformed the bay's waters into an arena for a deadly ballet of torpedo attacks. Russian, quote, 1-class destroyers, with their incredible speed of 37 knots and 450mm torpedo tubes, became a real nightmare for German captains. The commanders of these swift vessels employed, quote, 2 tactics. A group of 3 to 5 destroyers would attack a target from different directions, preventing the enemy's gunners from concentrating their fire. Lieutenant Kolchak's famous raid on the torpedo boat, quote, ended with the sinking of the German cruiser, quote, by 2 torpedoes launched from a mere 800 meters. The Germans countered the Russians with their U-19 class submarines. These submarines, capable of remaining submerged for up to 72 hours, would sneak up on Russian ships, utilizing currents and bottom topography. The torpedo attack by U-26 on the Russian battleship, quote, 5, nearly ended in disaster. The torpedo passed just 5 meters from the dreadnought's stern. The psychological impact of the torpedo threat on the crews of large ships is hard to overstate. An officer from the battlecruiser Moltke wrote in his diary, "Every splash of water seems like a periscope, every dolphin a torpedo. We live in constant tension, not knowing where death will come from." Russian sailors called this state torpedo fever, nervous exhaustion from the constant expectation of an attack. A special chapter in the history of the battle was written by the Russian submarines Akula and Gepard. Their commanders developed a unique double strike tactic. The first submarine would attack a German convoy, forcing the escort ships to concentrate on rescuing the attacked vessel, while the second, lying in ambush, would strike the unprotected transports. The torpedoes of those years were imperfect. Only 2 or 3 out of 10 launched would hit their targets. However, the very fact of their use forced German ships to keep their distance from Russian bases and to constantly maneuver, expending precious fuel and exhausting their crews. Admiral Cunning, commander of the Baltic Fleet, called this the strategy of indirect action, where the physical damage was less important than the change in enemy behavior. Torpedo attacks by small ships changed the very philosophy of naval combat. If previously the outcome of a battle was decided by battleships in an artillery duel, now Any torpedo boat could, with one successful torpedo, send to the bottom a ship that had taken years to build and cost millions. The roar of naval guns shattered the morning silence of the Gulf of Riga. The artillery duels that unfolded in these waters became the apotheosis of naval confrontation, a demonstration of the power and precision of early 20th century fire systems. The German battleship Nassau was the first to open fire on Russian positions, unleashing a salvo from its 350mm guns. 12 shells, each weighing over 700 kilograms, pierced the air at supersonic speed, creating a characteristic wail that sent shivers down one's spine. The Russian dreadnought Gangut responded 40 seconds later, the time it took the gunners to calculate wind and distance corrections. Its salvo landed 50 meters from the German flagship, raising huge columns of water. An artillery duel began, in which the accuracy of calculations was no less important than the power of the guns. Observer officers on both sides, armed with rangefinders and binoculars, desperately tried to adjust fire in conditions of limited visibility. The Baltic haze, notoriously known among sailors, distorted the perception of distances and complicated aiming. By noon, the weather presented a new surprise: a sudden squall with rain. Waves up to 3 meters high turned aiming into a true art. The ships pitched, which seriously affected firing accuracy. German artillerymen, trained in the traditions of Prussian methodicalness, used a salvo firing system. All main-caliber guns fired simultaneously, creating a veritable firestorm. The Russians preferred sequential fire, where each gun fired with a small interval, allowing for aiming adjustments based on the splashes from previous shells. Both tactics had their advantages and disadvantages. By the evening of the first day of battle, it became clear that German ships were expending ammunition almost twice as fast as Russian ones. This was explained not only by the difference in tactics, but also in the approach to fire discipline. Russian gunners opened fire only when there was a guaranteed chance of a hit, while the Germans relied on overwhelming firepower. A critical moment in the artillery duel was a direct hit by an 8-inch shell from the cruiser Rurik into the conning tower of the German Augsburg. The explosion destroyed the fire control system, and the cruiser temporarily lost its combat effectiveness. Russian artillerymen demonstrated amazing adaptability to changing battle conditions. When the wind intensified to force 8, they instantly recalculated the corrections and continued to deliver accurate fire. The Germans, however, encountered problems in the hydraulic drive systems of the gun turrets. The cold Baltic water falling on the deck caused interruptions in the operation of the mechanisms. The success of naval battles in the early 20th century was largely determined not only by the power of individual ships, but also by the ability of fleets to act as a single organism. In the Battle of the Gulf of Riga, the coordination of the Baltic fleets became a true test of naval science and the art of command. The Russian Empire first applied a system of unified command for heterogeneous forces. The staff of the Baltic Fleet, under the leadership of Vice Admiral Cunning, created a 3-tier coordination system. The strategic level defined the general plan of operation. The tactical level distributed tasks among formations, and the operational level monitored their execution in real time. Naval liaison officers were attached to each major ship and coastal battery, ensuring continuous information exchange. Communication systems of that time were far from perfect. The primary means of communication between ships was the semaphore, a system of flag signals that allowed messages to be transmitted within line of sight. At night, searchlights were used for Morse code. Radio communication, just entering naval practice, often failed due to atmospheric interference, and the primitiveness of equipment. Inter-allied coordination presented particular difficulty. British cruisers, periodically appearing in the Baltic waters, operated according to their own protocols, which created confusion in friend or foe identification. French naval officers, present on Russian ships as observers, struggled to overcome the language barrier. There was a catastrophic lack of translators. The chain of command often failed at critical moments of the battle. When the German battleship Nassau broke through the first line of defense, the order for the cruiser group to retreat was transmitted with a 17-minute delay, a critical time that cost damage to the cruiser Admiral Makarov. The Germans surpassed the Russians in the technical equipment of their communication systems. Their ships had advanced Telefunken radio stations, which allowed for stable communication at distances up to 150 kilometers. Message encoding was carried out using cipher machines, ensuring the secrecy of the transmitted information. One of the main problems of joint operations was the lack of coordinated actions between submarines and surface ships. Twice during the battle, Russian submarines were fired upon by their own destroyers due to the absence of a clear identification system. After these incidents, a special surfacing protocol was introduced. A submarine had to release 2 green signal flares before showing its periscope. The lessons in coordination learned in the Battle of Riga significantly influenced the development of naval tactics. For the first time in the history of naval warfare, the necessity of creating unified operational command centers capable of coordinating the actions of heterogeneous fleet forces in real time was proven. On August 8, 1915, the fate of the Gulf of Riga was decided in a series of critical engagements. At dawn, the German dreadnought Posen attempted to break through the narrow urban strait, covered by cruiser fire. The Russian battleship Slava, under the command of Captain First Rank Virubov, engaged in an unequal battle. Despite the enemy's numerical superiority, Virubov employed a brilliant tactical maneuver. By maneuvering at slow speed between the islands, he created the illusion of multiple ships present, forcing the Germans to disperse their fire. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a turning point in the battle occurred. The destroyer Novik, under the command of Lieutenant Berg, carried out a daring sortie, breaking through the line of German torpedo boats. Risking the lives of his crew, Berg closed in on the cruiser Augsburg to a direct torpedo firing range, just 500 meters. 2 torpedoes struck the German cruiser in the engine room area. The Augsburg lost speed and became an easy target for Russian coastal artillery. A special role in the battle was played by Rear Admiral Bakirev's tactical decision to divide his forces into 3 maneuverable groups. The first engaged the main enemy forces with frontal fire, the second attacked from the flank, and the third remained in reserve, ready to strike at the most vulnerable point. This classic "5" tactic allowed them to compensate for the lack of firepower. The German command made a critical error by concentrating their main forces at the northern entrance to the Gulf and leaving the southern flank practically open. The Russian submarine "6", under the command of Captain Lieutenant Merkushev, operating alone, sank 2 ammunition transports, which seriously undermined the combat potential of the German squadron. The crews on both sides displayed miracles of heroism. On the Russian torpedo boat "7", after a direct hit by an enemy shell, a fire started in the powder magazine. Senior officer Lieutenant Semyonov, understanding that the ship was doomed, ordered the crew to abandon ship, while he himself remained on board, attempting to flood the magazine and prevent an explosion. At the cost of his own life, he saved most of the crew. The German submarine commander U-27 Oberleutnant Schultz, after sustaining serious damage from depth charges, managed to run his submarine aground on the neutral Swedish coast, saving the lives of his submariners. For this feat, he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. By the evening of August 8th, it became evident that the German plan to break into the Gulf of Riga was failing. Having lost a cruiser, 2 destroyers, and 6 minesweepers, the German command decided to retreat and regroup their forces. The Russian fleet, despite the loss of a torpedo boat and damage to 2 cruisers, maintained control over the waters of the Gulf. The decisive factor in the victory was not only the bravery of the sailors, but also the flexibility of the Russian commander's tactical thinking. Unlike the Germans, who strictly adhered to their initial plan, they were able to improvise, adapting to the changing situation. As Admiral Essen later wrote in his memoirs, "In a naval battle, victory goes not to the strongest, but to him who best understands the language of waves and wind." The German naval doctrine applied in the Riga operation represented a complex alloy of many years of experience, technological superiority, and strategic risk. Vice Admiral Hipper, who commanded the operation, based his plan on 4 key principles: massive application of force, technological advantage, speed of maneuver, and psychological pressure. The Kaiser's command viewed the Gulf of Riga not merely as a tactical objective, but as a strategic springboard for further advance towards Petrograd, the heart of the Russian Empire. The calculations of the German headquarters were based on superiority in artillery power. Battleships of the N-1 classes had more modern fire control systems, allowing for accurate firing at distances up to 18 kilometers. German admirals believed they could suppress Russian coastal batteries before they inflicted significant damage on their fleet. However, this calculation did not account for the peculiarities of the Moonsund archipelago, where the rugged coastline allowed Russian artillerymen to effectively mask their positions. A particular risk was posed by mine danger. According to German intelligence, the Russians had laid no less than 1,500 mines of various types. To overcome them, a special mine-sweeping flotilla of 24 ships, equipped with the latest hydroacoustic devices, was formed. However, even with the most optimistic forecasts, sweeping was expected to take at least 3 days, a time during which the main forces of the fleet would remain vulnerable to attacks by Russian submarines and destroyers. The time factor played a decisive role in German calculations. Meteorologists predicted a, quote, "2 lasting no more than 5 days. After that, storms were expected in the Baltic, which would make accurate artillery fire and minesweeping impossible. This forced the Kaiser's fleet command to operate at its limits, reducing the necessary time for reconnaissance and preparation. The psychological aspect of the operation was also carefully calculated. The Germans planned to create an effect of surprise by attacking simultaneously from several directions. To increase psychological pressure, it was envisioned to use the latest Zeppelins for bombing Russian positions, a tactic not previously used in naval battles. The German command expected that the sight of airships appearing from the clouds would demoralize Russian sailors and force them to make tactical errors. One of the most risky elements of the German plan was the decision to divide the fleet into 3 operational groups. The first was to attack the main forces of the Russian fleet, the second to block the Moonsund Strait, and the third to land troops on Ossel Island. Such a distribution of forces contradicted the classical principle of concentrating power at the decisive point, but offered a chance for strategic success given ideal coordination of actions. The Russian command demonstrated astonishing flexibility in response to the German offensive in the Gulf of Riga. Adaptability became a key factor in the success of the Russian fleet, which, despite being technologically inferior to the enemy, managed to compensate for this with tactical inventiveness. Vice Admiral Nikolai Bakirev, who assumed command after the demise of Admiral von Essen, developed a system of echeloned defense that constantly evolved depending on the enemy's actions. When the Germans began massive sweeping of minefields, the Russian sailors did not adhere to the original plan of static defense. Instead, the tactic of, quote, zero was employed. Special mine layers would go out at night and lay new mines in passages already swept by the Germans. This unpredictability negated days of effort by German minesweepers and created constant psychological tension for the enemy. Russian artillerymen also demonstrated high adaptability. Noticing that German ships maneuvered in a certain way when evading fire, they developed a system of, quote, one, firing not at the ship's current position, but at its presumed point of movement. The effectiveness of hits increased by almost 30%, which came as an unpleasant surprise to German captains. In the face of the German fleet's numerical superiority, the Russian command opted for asymmetrical actions. Instead of direct confrontation with the enemy's powerful battleships, the main efforts were directed at destroying auxiliary vessels, minesweepers, supply transports, and reconnaissance ships. This clipping the wings strategy deprived the German squadron of mobility and intelligence support. The system of naval reconnaissance played a special role in the adaptive strategy of the Russians. M9 seaplanes, based on the islands of the Moonsund archipelago, conducted regular sorties, recording the movements of German ships. The obtained data was promptly analyzed by the fleet headquarters, which allowed anticipating enemy intentions and timely redeploying forces to threatened areas. A decisive factor in the success was the decentralization of command. Unlike the Germans, who strictly adhered to a hierarchical system where every decision was approved by higher authorities, Russian commanders had significant autonomy. Destroyer and submarine captains could independently make tactical decisions based on the specific situation, which made the actions of the Russian fleet unpredictable for the enemy. The effectiveness of the Russian strategy for defending the Gulf is confirmed by loss statistics. Despite the German superiority in firepower, the Russian fleet lost only 3 ships, while the enemy lost 11 units, including a cruiser and several destroyers. Moreover, the main objective of the operation, maintaining control over the Gulf of Riga, was achieved with minimal losses. The Battle of the Gulf of Riga became a true laboratory for naval thought of the early 20th century. French and Polish observers present at these events saw in them not merely a clash of fleets, but a turning point in the development of maritime technologies. The French naval mission, led by Captain First Rank Jacques Dupré, paid particular attention to the application of the latest combat means. In his secret report to the Ministry of Marine, he noted, "Russian minefields overturned the understanding of naval tactics. Now even the most powerful dreadnought can be stopped by an invisible threat, the cost of which is hundreds of times less than its own." French specialists were astonished by the effectiveness of Russian mines of the 1908 model with Hertz detonators, which activated even with a slight touch to the ship's hull. This technology was immediately adopted by the French fleet, leading to the creation of the Breguet Riga mine, an improved version of the Russian original. Polish military observers, despite the absence of their own state at that period, actively gathered information through officers of Polish origin serving in the Russian and German fleets. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislaw Kozłowski, the future creator of the Polish Navy, compiled a detailed analysis of the actions of small ships in the Riga operation. His concept of a mosquito fleet, a multitude of small but well-armed vessels capable of confronting large combat units, subsequently became the basis of Polish naval doctrine. The French were particularly impressed by the use of seaplanes for artillery fire adjustment. Lieutenant Pierre Lebrun, seconded to Russian aviation, wrote, "Aerial reconnaissance completely changes the nature of naval combat. There is no longer room for surprises and covert maneuvers. The sky has become the all-seeing eye of the fleet commander." This observation led to the creation of the first French naval aviation program, launched in 1916. Polish military theorists drew another important lesson from the Battle of Riga: the significance of coastal defense. Engineer Colonel Tadeusz Nowakowski developed the concept of a coastal fortress, a system of coastal batteries, minefields, and mobile units capable of protecting the coast even in the absence of a powerful fleet. This concept was implemented in the creation of the Polish coastal defense system in Gdynia and Hel during the interwar period. The technological innovations applied in the Battle of Riga had a profound impact on French shipbuilding. Cruisers of the Duguay-Trouin class, laid down after the war, received reinforced anti-mine armor and improved anti-submarine warfare systems, a direct result of the analysis of German fleet losses in the Riga operation. For future Poland, the experience of the Battle of Riga became the foundation for creating its own naval forces after gaining independence. The asymmetric strategy demonstrated by the Russian fleet against superior enemy forces was adopted as the basis of Polish naval doctrine. As Admiral Józef Unrug, the first commander of the Polish fleet, noted, "We cannot compete in the number of battleships, but we can surpass the enemy in tactical flexibility and the use of new technologies." London fogs concealed not only streets and buildings, but also the tense faces of officers of the British Admiralty. Events in the distant Gulf of Riga became the subject of close attention for the naval strategists of the world's greatest naval power. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill personally ordered the creation of a special analytical group to study the experience of this battle. The group worked day and night, gathering intelligence reports, naval attaché reports, and intercepted German radio messages. The results of their work landed on Churchill's desk in the form of a voluminous report marked Top Secret. British analysts were particularly impressed by the effectiveness of Russian mine barrages. The Russians transformed the mine from an auxiliary weapon into a strategic instrument of sea control, the report noted. This observation led to a revision of British mine doctrine and the creation of specialized mine-sweeping flotillas to protect the approaches to Scapa Flow, the main base of the British fleet. No less attention was drawn to the tactics of using small ships against large combat units. Rear Admiral Reginald Hall, head of naval intelligence, wrote, "Russian Novik-class destroyers demonstrated that speed and maneuverability can successfully counter armor and firepower. We cannot afford to ignore this lesson." As a result, the British fleet accelerated the construction program for V-class destroyers, which possessed increased speed and enhanced torpedo armament. The effectiveness of German submarines caused particular concern among British strategists. Despite limited success in the Riga operation, the very fact that submarines could penetrate minefields and attack large ships forced the Admiralty to revise its anti-submarine defense system. This led to the creation of the first hydroacoustic stations and the development of new design depth charges. The British fleet also learned technical lessons. The Admiralty's engineering department carefully studied the damage sustained by ships during the battle. Particular attention was drawn to problems with fire control systems in rough seas. As a result, advanced stabilizers for artillery rangefinders were installed on British Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. The influence of the Riga experience on British naval strategy proved to be long-lasting. Admiral John Jellicoe, commander of the Grand Fleet, made significant adjustments to plans for a possible general engagement with the German fleet. Instead of relying solely on battleships, he developed a concept of combined use of heavy and light forces, where destroyers and cruisers played not an auxiliary, but an independent tactical role. British naval intelligence also learned valuable lessons. The surveillance system in the Baltic region was strengthened. New agents appeared in the neutral ports of Sweden and Denmark, whose task was to track the movements of the German fleet. Radio interception was raised to a new level. Special stations on the east coast of England monitored the airwaves around the clock, catching even the weakest signals from the Baltic. Perhaps the most important conclusion drawn by the British was an understanding of the changed nature of naval warfare. The era of grandiose clashes of linear fleets was receding into the past. It was being replaced by a war of minefields, submarines, and fast destroyers, a war where technological superiority and tactical flexibility meant more than the number of main-caliber guns. In the shadow of the great maritime powers, Spain closely observed the events in the Gulf of Riga, seeing in them a chance to revive its once legendary naval might. The Madrid Naval Cabinet, headed by Admiral José Pidal, established a special analytical group that studied every aspect of the Baltic confrontation. Spanish observers, formerly maintaining neutrality, had a unique opportunity to obtain information from both warring parties. Captain First Rank Miguel Cervera, naval attaché in Petrograd, regularly sent detailed reports on the tactics of the Russian fleet to Madrid. His colleague in Berlin, Commander Luis Vergara, did the same regarding German naval forces. Spanish strategists were particularly impressed by the effectiveness of mine warfare. The Russians turned the Gulf of Riga into an impregnable fortress with weapons whose cost is hundreds of times less than the price of a single battleship, Admiral Pidal noted in his report. This conclusion led to a fundamental revision of Spanish naval doctrine. Instead of building expensive dreadnoughts, which a country with limited resources could not afford in sufficient numbers, the emphasis was placed on the development of mine torpedo forces and coastal defense. The Fleet Revival Program, adopted in 1916, envisioned the construction of 40 Churuka-type destroyers and 12 Isaac Peral-class submarines. These ships, designed with the experience of the Riga operation in mind, were characterized by high speed and powerful torpedo armament. The Spanish paid special attention to analyzing the coordination of diverse forces in the Battle of Riga. The control system of the Russian Baltic Fleet, which allowed for effective interaction between ships of various classes, was taken as a model for the reorganization of the Spanish fleet. The first school of tactical interaction in Spanish history was established in Cadiz, where officers of various specialties learned to work as a unified team. The Riga experience also influenced Spanish naval construction. Engineer Captain Juan Antonio Suances, having studied data on ship damage during the battle, developed a new armor scheme for Spanish cruisers. Special attention was paid to protecting the underwater part of the hull and vital ship systems from mines and torpedoes. The greatest interest among Spanish analysts was aroused by the Russian coastal defense system. The combination of stationary batteries, minefields, and mobile units, which allowed the Gulf of Riga to be protected from superior enemy forces, was ideally suited for the defense of the Spanish coast. Based on this experience, the concept of the Spanish Sea Wall was developed, a system of fortified points from Cadiz to Barcelona. The strategic planning of the Spanish fleet also underwent significant changes. Instead of preparing for a general battle with a superior enemy, the emphasis was placed on asymmetric warfare, the use of mines, torpedo attacks, and raids by fast ships. This doctrine, named Strategy of the Sea Wolf, became the basis of Spanish naval thinking for decades to come. The Battle of Riga Bay became a turning point in the balance of power in the Baltic. When the last salvos faded and the gunpowder smoke cleared, the strategic picture of the region changed irreversibly. The Russian Empire retained control over a vital sea route, which had far-reaching consequences for the entire Eastern Front. The German plan to break through to Petrograd was thwarted, and the Kaiser's command had to reconsider its entire strategy for Baltic operations. First and foremost, the nature of control over sea lanes changed. If before the battle, the German fleet could move relatively freely throughout the Baltic Sea, now its actions were significantly restricted. Russian mine barrages, which had proven their effectiveness, were strengthened and expanded, turning the approaches to the Gulf of Finland and Riga Bay into an impassable barrier for large enemy ships. The economic consequences of the battle proved no less significant. Retaining control over Riga Bay allowed Russia to continue maritime trade through the Baltic ports, which was critically important for supplying the army and industry. According to economists of the time, up to 20% of the country's total military imports passed through these ports, including vital machine tools, instruments, and raw materials. The psychological effect of the Russian fleet's victory is hard to overestimate. Amidst a general retreat on the land front, success in a naval battle became a powerful moral boost for the entire army and population. Newspapers of the time wrote about, quote, "zero," and the names of destroyer and submarine commanders became known throughout the country. For Germany, the defeat in the Riga operation meant the collapse of its strategy for a quick victory on the Eastern Front. Plans for a landing operation against Petrograd had to be postponed indefinitely, and significant naval forces found themselves tied down by the need to patrol the Baltic. This indirectly affected the Western Front as well, as some resources intended for combating the British fleet now had to be kept in the Baltic theater. The military and political consequences of the battle extended far beyond the immediate conflict zone. Sweden, previously inclined to an alliance with Germany, adopted a more cautious stance, seeing that the Kaiser's fleet was not omnipotent. Finland, still part of the Russian Empire but already showing separatist tendencies, temporarily reduced the activity of nationalist movements. Of particular importance was the change in the operational situation in the region. The Russian Baltic fleet gained freedom of action in the eastern part of the sea, which allowed it to intensify mine-laying off the German coast and disrupt enemy communications. Bars-class submarines could now operate more aggressively, having a reliable rear in the form of protected bases in Riga Bay. The further course of military operations in the region was directly linked to the results of the battle. Germany was forced to shift from a strategy of decisive offensive to a positional struggle for control over key points in the Baltic Sea. The main efforts were transferred to submarine warfare and raiding operations by light forces, which required much more time to achieve results. The Battle of the Gulf of Riga, which took place over a century ago, may today seem merely a page of military history. However, its lessons remain relevant for modern navies facing the challenges of the 21st century. The legacy of this operation extends far beyond its time, shaping the fundamental principles of naval confrontation and control of sea areas. First and foremost, The Riga operation proved the superiority of asymmetric strategy over brute force. The Russian fleet, inferior to the German in terms of the number and power of battleships, managed to achieve victory through the complex use of mines, torpedoes, and maneuverable tactics. This principle remains a cornerstone of modern naval doctrine for many countries, especially those that cannot compete with leading maritime powers in the number of aircraft carriers and missile cruisers. Mine warfare in the Gulf of Riga demonstrated the effectiveness of zonal control of sea areas. Modern navies have developed this concept into the creation of anti-access/area denial A2/AD systems, which include not only mines but also coastal missile systems, electronic warfare systems, and underwater sensor networks. The tactics tested in the waters of the Baltic are now applied in the Persian Gulf, the South China Sea, and other strategically important regions of the world ocean. The coordination of heterogeneous forces, demonstrated in the Battle of Riga, anticipated the modern concept of network-centric warfare. Today, the navies of leading maritime powers are developing integrated control systems that allow combining the capabilities of aviation, surface ships, submarines, and space-based intelligence assets. The principle laid down by Russian and German admirals has found new embodiment in the era of digital technologies. The psychological aspect of naval warfare, vividly manifested in the Riga operation, retains its significance even now. Modern navies pay great attention to information operations aimed at demoralizing the enemy and strengthening the morale of their own crews. Technologies have changed, but the human factor still plays a decisive role in naval confrontation. The experience of using small ships against large combat units has been continued in the modern concept of swarm attacks. Unmanned surface and underwater vehicles acting in concert in large groups pose a serious threat even to the most protected ships. This strategy is a direct heir to the tactics of Russian destroyers attacking German battleships in the waters of the Gulf of Riga. The importance of coastal defense, demonstrated in the battle, has acquired new meaning in the era of high-precision weapons. Modern coastal defense systems include not only artillery, but also anti-ship missile systems capable of hitting targets beyond the horizon. The principle of echeloned coastal defense, successfully applied by the Russians, is now being implemented at a new technological level. For 21st century navies, the experience of adaptive command, demonstrated in the Riga operation, is of particular value. In a dynamically changing environment and constantly evolving threats, the ability to quickly reconfigure tactics and strategy becomes a decisive factor for success. Modern commanders study this historical experience to develop flexibility of thinking and the ability to make unconventional decisions. Finally, the Battle of Riga reminds us of the importance of controlling sea communications, a principle that has not lost its relevance over the past century. In the era of globalization, when 90% of world trade is carried out by sea, ensuring the security of shipping remains a priority for the navies of all countries. The methods of solving this problem have changed, but the strategic goal remains the same. Thus, the Battle of the Gulf of Riga, despite its historical remoteness, continues to influence the development of naval art. Its lessons, reinterpreted in the context of modern technologies and geopolitical realities, form the basis of 21st century maritime strategies. History once again confirms its cyclical nature. Principles tested in the waters of the Baltic over a century ago remain relevant in the era of hypersonic missiles and artificial intelligence.